Rona Royeras for the Christian prayer and Mr. Hisham Beruar for the Muslim prayer, to be followed by the singing of the Philippine National Anthem.
Let us place ourselves in the holy presence of God, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Heavenly Father, we are gathered here once more before you in gratitude, for you have guided the hand of the justice and looked upon this country with favor. You have rewarded the efforts of those who have defended the rights of this country, granting us victory in the eyes of the law. But again, we find ourselves being challenged amidst the growing tension in the political sphere. It is thus with humility that we ask you, Father, to strengthen our principles as a nation, and to keep giving strength to those who are at the forefront of this endeavor. Enlighten us that we may, through this afternoon's lecture, harness our role as citizens of this country who must be ever vigilant for its well-being. Help us as we strive for a peaceful settlement, not just with other nations, but within our own country as well. All these we pray in your name, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alamin Ar-Rahmanir-Rahim Malik Yawmiddin. Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in ihdinas siratal mustaqim. Siratal ladzina an'amta 'alaihim ghairil maghdubi 'alaihim waladdallin. Amen. In the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful. Praise be to God, the Lord of the universe, the most gracious, the most merciful, Master of the day of judgment. You alone we worship, and you alone we ask for help. Guide us to the right path, the path of those whom you blessed, and not of those who have deserved wrath, nor of the strayers. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Kul huwallahu ahad, Allahu samad, lam yalid walam yulad walam yakul lahu kufuwan ahad. In the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful. Say, He is Allah, the one and only, the eternal, the absolute. He begets not, nor is He begotten, nor is there to Him any equivalent. Rabbana atina fid dunya hasana wa fil akhirati hasana wa qina azabannar.
Please be seated. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Master of Ceremonies, Attorney Cecilia Hover Angeles.
Good afternoon, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen inside the auditorium, and the students of the Ateneo, the Davao University at Thibault Hall, who are with us via live streaming. I would like to welcome you all to this afternoon's presentation and forum, the West Philippine Sea, South China Sea Dispute, the arbitration decision and its challenges. In December last year, the College of Law brought to this hall for the first time a presentation on this burning issue at a time when the Philippines had just finished its oral arguments on the merits before the UN Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague, Netherlands. On July 12 this year, the Philippines finally received some good news from The Hague. We won. Now, what's next? This afternoon's presentation is a sequel to the first. The part 2 we need to hear so we may know if the story has a happy ending. I would like to call on the Dean of the College of Law, the indefatigable Attorney Manuel P. Quibod, for the welcome message.
Our university president, Father Joel E. Tabora of the Society of Jesus, cannot be with us this afternoon due to some other equally important university affairs he has to attend in Manila. He, however, sends his regards and thanks for taking time to attend this event. And the Ateneo de Davao University community, we welcome all of you to attend this lecture forum. Our audience is not only here at this hall, but we are actually on live streaming at the ground floor of this Finster hall to accommodate other crowd. We have set up a video wall there for all the other students and guests who may not be accommodated in this venue. We have invited varied sectors and groups in our Davao community, the professionals, media, business, government, members of the judiciary, the prosecution service, and the academe. Welcome and thank you for your attendance. From the in the government's relentless campaign against illegal drugs and the toxic verbal in your DU30 and their D5. By the way, they are not vitamins, no? Nor antioxidants, which are grabbing media attention in print and broadcast. The arbitration decision at The Hague in connection with the West Philippine Sea or South China Sea dispute is likewise getting equal media attention. On July 12, 2016, the UN's Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague ruled in favor of the Philippines that China's claim to almost all of the South China Sea had no basis in international law, and China's 9-dash line had no legal basis. China did not have historical rights to the South China Sea and had violated Philippines' sovereign rights in its exclusive economic zone by interexploration to prevent Chinese. However, China refused to accept and recognize the decision. Days before the ruling, President Duterte said his administration stood ready to talk to China if the Philippines gets a favorable ruling. On August 8, 2016, former President Fidel B. Ramos, as special envoy, went to China to initiate talks and discuss possibility of restoring traditional fishing rights in the disputed Scarborough Shoal or the Panatag. The backdoor negotiation was described as encouraging. Despite the ruling, Philippine fishermen continued to be chased off the Scarborough Shoal. The Ateneo de Davao University and the College of Law are honored to host this forum in Davao and invited a very distinguished resource person who will be properly introduced in a while to explain the arbitration decision, its ramifications, and challenges. I would like also to thank all the men and women, our law faculty, students, and staff who work hard to put this event on the road. Thank you to Attorney Cecil Angeles of our law faculty and her team for preparing, organizing, and coordinating this event. Once again, we welcome all of you. We look forward to a fruitful and engaging conversation. Thank you and good afternoon.
Thank you, Dean Kibod. Our speaker this afternoon is by this time no longer a stranger to those who follow closely the South China Sea, West Philippine Sea dispute. I first attended one of his presentations in 2011 before the alumni of the College of Law, 2 years before the Philippines filed the arbitration case against China. That was not his first, though. His presentations or television fervently advocacy to protect and preserve Philippine territorial and maritime sovereignty, specifically in the West Philippine Sea. His passion has brought him on a campaign trail, both national and international, to educate the Filipinos and the international community of this nagging dispute with its giant neighbor. He uses ancient maps of China to demolish its claim on the entire South China Sea. It is truly a visual sight to see these reproductions of ancient maps on exhibit during his lectures. This effort has brought Justice Carpio to some 18 countries and 28 key cities, and still counting. He has also met and briefed our national leaders, making sure that the Philippine government keeps its focus and its momentum in this fight for our territorial and maritime rights. Justice Carpio is one of the leading legal minds in the Philippine panel. On the suggestion of Justice Carpio, the Philippines also raised the issue on what steps to take to stop the reclamation activities in China while the dispute resolution process is going on. The wealth of his knowledge on the dispute and his firm grasp of the UN Convention of the Law of Sea has made him an invaluable member of the Philippine team. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Justice Antonio T. Carpio.
Please be seated. A pleasant afternoon to everyone. I wish to thank Dean Manny Kibod for inviting me here this afternoon to make this presentation. And I want to thank everyone present here for attending this presentation. This is actually the third time I'll be talking before an audience of the Ateneo de Davao College of Law on this issue. The very first time I discussed this was in 2011 during the 50th anniversary of the Ateneo de Davao College of Law. And that was actually the first time that I made a public appeal that we bring the maritime dispute with China before an UNCLOS tribunal. That was the start of my campaign to convince the Philippine government to file an arbitration case against China. The second time I was here was in 2015, at the end of 2015, after the tribunal made a ruling on the jurisdictional issue. And last July, there was the final ruling. And so I'm here now to discuss with you the final ruling. So the genesis of this arbitration was actually first brought to the public here in the College of Law of Ateneo de Davao. So if you look at the screen, you will see there the 9 dashed lines map. That is the root cause of the dispute in the South China Sea. China submitted that to the United Nations in 2009, and you see the 9 dashed lines. And China claimed everything within the 9 dashed lines. These are the high seas in the South China Sea. You have here the EEZ of the Philippines, the EEZ of Malaysia, Brunei, Malaysia again, Indonesia, and Vietnam. And the 9 dashed lines gobble up large areas of the EEZs of these coastal countries, even the high seas are claimed by China. So China actually claims everything within the 9 dash lines without saying so, but actually in practice, China claims everything. Let's go to some concepts so we can understand this better. Assuming this is Palawan, from the low water mark, you measure the 12 nautical miles, you have the territorial sea. From the edge of the territorial sea, you measure 188 nautical miles. You have the exclusive economic zone. It's called exclusive economic zone because the exploitation of this zone, the economic exploitation of this zone, belongs to the coastal state, the adjacent coastal state. That means all the living and non-living resources here can be exploited economically only by the adjacent coastal state. From the edge of the 200 nautical mile EEZ, you measure 150 nautical miles, and you have the extended continental shelf. A state can claim an extended continental shelf if there is a natural prolongation of the continental shelf. In other words, there is no deep trench that breaks the natural prolongation. If there is a deep trench that breaks the natural prolongation, then the extended continental shelf will be up to that deep trench. So the maximum that a coastal state can claim in the South China Sea, because of the geology and geomorphology of the South China Sea, is 350 nautical miles from the coastline. That's the maximum. China is claiming beyond that, contrary to UNCLOS. So from here, from the EEZ to the high seas, you have what is called freedom of navigation and overflight, both for civilian vessels and military vessels and aircraft. There's freedom of navigation. All countries can sail here with their civilian ships and military ships or aircraft. So those are the concepts. Another concept, the last one, is the concept on low tide elevations and high tide elevations. This is a low tide elevation because this is low tide. At high tide, it's totally covered with water. This one is not entitled to a territorial sea. It has no territorial airspace. It is not considered land. It is not territory. It's part of the submerged continental shelf. This one is a high tide elevation because at high tide, you still see it above water. And this is entitled to a 12 nautical mile territorial sea. It has a territorial airspace. This one is an island. Of course, it's entitled to a 12 nautical mile territorial sea. And if it is capable of human habitation or economic life of its own, it's entitled to a 200 nautical mile EEZ. And if there's a natural prolongation of its continental shelf, another 150 nautical mile. This is an important issue in the Spratlys because of Ito-Aba. We will go into that also. Now, in 1995, China seized Mischief Reef from the Philippines. Mischief Reef is a low tide elevation. At high tide, it's totally submerged. And this is it. China put this up in 1995. China said this is just a fisherman's shelter. Now, Mischief Reef is midway between Palawan and Pag-asa, the largest island that we occupy in the Spratlys. So we sat down with China and explained to China, Mischief Reef is within our continental shelf. It's a submerged area, therefore under UNCLOS it belongs to us. China would say, we have indisputable sovereignty over the South China Sea that is enclosed by the 9 dash lines, so that belongs to us. And there's nothing to talk because we have indisputable sovereignty over Mischief Reef. And we talked to China from 1995 up to 2012, and we get the same refrain. We have indisputable sovereignty over Mischief Reef and the rest of the waters enclosed by the 9 dash lines because we own that since 2,000 years ago. In 2012, China again seized Scarborough Shoal from the Philippines. It's a high tide elevation. At high tide, you still see a rock protruding above water, 1.2 meters above water. And so we face this problem. Should we continue talking to China For the next 17 years, China will say the same thing. You know, in 2012, the world has forgotten about Mischief Reef. So if we talk to China, for another 10, 17 years, the world will forget about Scarborough Shoal. So we decided to take a different tack. We decided to bring China to an arbitration under UNCLOS because, well, we really didn't have any other option. In 1995, when China seized Mischief Reef, we did not have the military capability to retake Mischief Reef. No Navy, no Air Force. 2012, even worse, because we did not have a single fighter jet in 2012. So we decided to bring China to an arbitration. And what were the issues we raised? We raised 6 major issues. The first issue, China's claim to historic rights under the 9 dash lines is contrary to UNCLOS and cannot be the basis of any maritime entitlement. In other words, the 9 dash lines cannot be the basis for China to claim a territorial sea, an exclusive economic zone, or an extended continental shelf. This is the major issue that we raised. If we won this issue alone, it would have been a major victory already, because that would strike down the 9 dash lines and that will create the high seas in the middle of the South China Sea and exclusive economic zones all around that. The next issue we raised is that in the Spratlys, there is no island that is capable of human habitation so as to generate a 200 nautical mile EEZ that would overlap with Palawan's EEZ. And we also raised the issue that when we put in issue the maritime entitlement of Scarborough Shoal, whether it's entitled to 12 or 200, that is not a sovereignty issue. We're not asking the court to decide who owns or has sovereignty over Scarborough Shoal. Maritime entitlement is separate from sovereignty. And also, whether it's a low tide or high tide, that's not a question of who owns, that's a question of maritime entitlement. And also, that maritime entitlement is separate from sea boundary delimitation. Why? Because an UNCLOS tribunal has no jurisdiction over sovereignty issues. It has jurisdiction over maritime issues. So we have to frame our case in such a way that it will fall within the jurisdiction of the tribunal. So we said we're not asking the tribunal to decide who has sovereignty over Scarborough Shoal. We're asking the tribunal to decide what is the maritime entitlement of Scarborough Shoal, 12 nautical miles or 200. And we're saying that when we ask the tribunal to rule on the maritime entitlement, it does not mean we're asking the tribunal to decide on a boundary delimitation, because a boundary delimitation will arise if there are overlapping exclusive economic zones, and our position was that there is no overlapping economic zone in the Spratlys or anywhere else. The fourth issue we raised is, of course, on Scarborough Shoal, where there is a rock entitled only to 12 nautical miles, and that we have traditional fishing rights in the territorial sea of Scarborough Shoal. Fifth, that China caused severe harm to the marine environment. And sixth, China committed other unlawful acts against the Philippines within the Philippines EEZ. Let's go to the first issue. And what did the tribunal rule? The ruling of the tribunal: the 9 dash lines have no legal effect and cannot claim any maritime zone under UNCLOS. In short, in the words of the tribunal, there was no legal basis for China to claim historic rights to resources within the sea areas falling within the 9 dash line. China and other coastal states cannot extend beyond the limits prescribed under UNCLOS, cannot extend beyond 350 nautical miles. China is claiming Reed Bank, that's 595 nautical miles from Hainan. China is claiming James Shoal in Malaysia, 950 nautical miles from Hainan. Maritime entitlements must be claimed only from land. That is basic under the law of the sea. The basic principle is land dominates the sea. It means before you can claim a territorial sea, you must have land. To claim an EEZ, you must have land. So all these maritime entitlements, the source of that is land. You must have land. In the 9 dash lines, from what land China measured the lines, because Hainan is 950 nautical miles away from James Shoal. The tribunal also ruled all historic rights in the EEZ, extended continental shelf, high seas, were extinguished upon effectivity of UNCLOS. The UNCLOS was negotiated from 1973 to 1982, and China actively participated from day one. China was a very active participant, so it cannot say that this is a Western imposition. China was there from the very start, and the biggest obstacle during the negotiation was this: what would be the breadth of the exclusive economic zone? Some states wanted 50 nautical miles, others 100, 200, 300, 400, 500. The countries with huge fishing fleet wanted a very narrow exclusive economic zone. Why? Because in the EEZ, there is exclusive right of the coastal state to fish. So the countries with huge fishing fleets wanted a narrow EEZ so that the high seas will be wider, because in the high seas, everybody can fish. The landlocked countries also wanted the EEZ to be narrow for the same reason. They can fish in the high seas. So there was this big issue, and there had to be a compromise, and the compromise was made. Everybody gets 200 nautical mile EEZ and must waive all other claims beyond the EEZ. And in the EEZ, it's called exclusive because the right to exploit that exclusively belongs to the adjacent coastal state. That was the agreement. You get 200, it's exclusively yours. Beyond that, you have to waive all other claims, because if you don't waive, then there will be no peace and stability in the oceans and seas of our planet. The purpose of UNCLOS is to provide peace and stability. So you are given a definite area as your exclusive zone. You cannot claim anything else. Otherwise, there will be conflict again. So that's why the tribunal said all historic rights in the EEZ were extinguished upon the effectivity of UNCLOS. And this is very basic in UNCLOS. The members of the tribunal studied UNCLOS. They taught UNCLOS. They wrote books, textbooks on UNCLOS. They practiced UNCLOS. They were members of other tribunals. And they know by heart that all historic claims in the EEZ were already extinguished. And that's why we were sure that the tribunal would strike down the 9 dash lines as a claim to the EEZ of the Philippines. And they did. The tribunal further said, and this is very important, there was no evidence that China had historically exercised exclusive control over the waters of the South China Sea or their resources. The tribunal said there is no evidence that China historically controlled the South China Sea, contrary to the claim of China. The tribunal did not have to make this statement. They could have ended here, because all historic rights in the EEZ extended continental shelf have been extinguished. There can be no dispute about that. But the tribunal went further. No evidence. And I will explain why this is very important. Because of the narrative of China that since 2,000 years ago, they already owned the South China Sea. They were the first to discover, name, explore, exploit the resources of the South China Sea. That's the historical narrative, and I will explain that later. So, before the tribunal issued its ruling, this was the claim of China. China claimed all of this, the green area. When the 9 dash lines were struck down by the tribunal, that claim of China is gone. And we have now the high seas, 25% of the South China Sea. You have here the EEZ of the Philippines, free from the 9 dash line claim. So history here is very important because of the claim of China. How did we show to the tribunal that China never claimed the South China Sea since 2,000 years ago? Well, we submitted the ancient maps of China. This is the oldest map of China that I could find, 1136, China and the barbarian countries. If this were printed on paper, it would have crumbled already. But this is engraved in stone. This is a stone map, and there's only one. And you can still see this stone map in the Museum of Stone Steels in Xi'an, China. It's still there. This is a stone rubbing made by a Frenchman in the 1930s, and it shows Hainan as the southernmost territory of China. Throughout the Chinese dynasties, the southernmost territory of China has always been Hainan. From the Song to the Yuan to the Ming to the Qing, it's all Hainan as their southernmost territory. So we fast forward to the last dynasty of China, the Qing dynasty. It ended in 1912. This is the last official map of the Qing dynasty that I could find. It's entitled The Qing Empire's Complete Map of All Provinces. And you can see in inset Hainan as the southernmost part of Chinese territory. Throughout the dynasties of China, Hainan has always been part of Guangdong province. So throughout the dynasties, Hainan has always been the southernmost territory. So if you superimpose that on the map of Asia, there, Hainan as the southernmost territory of China, the Spratlys are here, the Paracels are here, and Scarborough is here. The territory of China never reached the Paracels, the Spratlys, or Scarborough Shoal. How about our own narrative? The National Geographic published this last 2014. For centuries, the South China Sea was known by navigators throughout Asia as the Champa Sea, named for a great empire that controlled all of central Vietnam. Where is Champa? The ancestors of the Chams spoke a Malayo-Polynesian language derived from the Austronesian language. Tagalog is derived from the Malayo-Polynesian language, which is derived from the Austronesian language. So we belong to the same family of languages as the Chams. We spoke the same language that's derived from the Austronesian language, and the Chams had a sailboat with outrigger. Now, the outrigger is a unique development of the Austronesians. It enabled the Austronesians to populate Southeast Asia, Micronesia, Polynesia, all the way to Madagascar, to Easter Island, the entire Indonesian islands, Java, and insular Malaysia, because the outrigger could carry them to very far areas. We have our balangay, which is an outrigger. It's a double outrigger. So that is the technology at the time that allowed these seafaring people to sail far, cross the oceans, cross the seas. So the Austronesians really were the masters of the South China Sea before the South China Sea was called the South China Sea. They were the masters of the Pacific Ocean because they populated the entire Pacific islands in the Pacific. This map, I wasn't able to present it to the tribunal because when I look at this map, I didn't see anything that distinctive that would help us. But one day while I was enlarging the map on my computer screen, I found out that all the islands in the South China Sea were called pulo, 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 all. And pulo is a Tagalog word, which means island, an isolated place. Now, this is a map made by Linscoten in 1596. Now, that was during the Ming Dynasty. The Ming Dynasty ended in 1644. During the Ming Dynasty, the islands in the South China Sea were called pulo, a Tagalog word, because Linscoten was the private secretary of the Archbishop of Goa, a Portuguese procession, and the Portuguese sailors were the first to go to the South China Sea, first Europeans. And when they visited these islands, they asked the natives there, "What's the name of your island?" Pulo Cambrir, Pulo Pirfir. Tagalog word. So the people there were Austronesians, our ancestors. So, very simple. They were called Pulo. Palawan is Pulawan. Palau is Pulo. So both sides, in the Pacific side and the South China side, the islands were called Pulo because the people there spoke Austronesian language, our ancestors. Another map by Mercator, a famous map maker also, it shows Pulo. All the islands were named Pulo. We were the masters of the South China Sea long before the South China Sea was called South China Sea, the Austronesians. Now, this is the famous Selden map of China. It's called Selden map because this was donated by John Selden to the Oxford Library, the Bodleian Library. Who is John Selden? I included this map because John Selden wrote the book Mare Clausum, the Closed Sea, in response to the book of Hugo Grotius, Mare Liberum, or the Free Sea. Hugo Grotius wrote Mare Liberum, laid the foundation for the law of the sea. Hugo Grotius, of course, we all know, is the father of international law. And he also laid the foundation for the law of the sea with this seminal book, Mare Liberum. The British King, James I, asked John Selden to write a rebuttal, Mare Clausum. In Mare Liberum, Hugo Grotius claimed that the oceans and seas belong to mankind. It cannot be appropriated or owned by any state. Mare Clausum, under John Selden, he said oceans and seas can be owned by states. There was this clash between two intellectual giants, and this debate went on for almost a century. At that time, it's not like today, you write a blog, it's answered immediately. At that time, you have to print it, and then it's shipped. So it took time. It's a slow motion debate. But Hugo Grotius won that debate. The world said, Hugo Grotius is correct. Beyond the territorial sea of 3 nautical miles, the cannon shot rule, beyond that, belongs to mankind. Nobody can own the seas. The high seas started 3 nautical miles from the high water mark at that time. They chose the 3 water mark because that's the longest distance that a cannonball could travel. That's the longest distance that you can defend your waters, so up to 3 nautical miles. So 2 intellectual giants fought. Mare Liberum won, Hugo Grotius. That's why he's the father of international law, because he also wrote the book, The Laws of War and Peace. So now, John Selden wrote his Mare Clausum while he was looking at this. He acquired this before he wrote Mare Clausum. And if you look at this is the South China Sea here. It has shipping routes. It will show that the South China Sea was a free international waterway. Countries from Japan, Taiwan, Indonesia, they all sailed in the South China Sea. It was not owned by China. Everybody used. This was during the Ming Dynasty. So it's ironical because John Selden wrote The Closed Sea while he was looking at the map which shows an open sea. But they said that he wrote Mare Clausum because he was actually jailed. He was an anti-monarchist. He wanted to get out of jail and probably offered to the king to write the rebuttal. So he wrote Mare Clausum, and he was freed. Now, there is this map. This is the first map of China ever published in Europe. And it shows Hainan as the southernmost territory of China. This was made by Samuel Purchas, based on an old Chinese woodblock map. That's why he included the old Chinese engravings in the Chinese map. Who is Samuel Purchas? Why did I include this map? Because Samuel Purchas was the Englishman who translated Mare Liberum from Latin to English. So he had a map showing that China's southernmost territory was Hainan, the first map of China ever published in Europe. So you have the dynasty maps of China showing that Hainan has always been the southernmost territory of China, and you have also maps of Europeans, map of other countries showing that Hainan has always been the territory, of southernmost territory. How about the Philippines, 1734? Father Pedro Murillo Velarde, a Jesuit priest, published this. This was with the help of two Filipinos. Nicolas de la Cruz Bagay is the engraver, and Francisco Suarez is the one who drew this. And it shows Panakot. This is Scarborough Shoal. Why is it called Panakot? Panakot means danger. If you are the captain of a ship and you don't know where Panakot is, your ship will hit the rocks of Panakot, and that's exactly what happened to a British tea clipper ship called Scarborough Shoal. That's why European cartographers called the shoal Scarborough, because the Scarborough ship ran aground there. For the first time, this is the first map that gave a name to Panakot, to Scarborough. Before that, Scarborough, Panakot appeared in older maps but without a name, just a shoal with no name. So this is the first name ever given to Scarborough Shoal, a Tagalog name, Panakot. And this same map also has this, Los Bajos de Paragua. Paragua is the old name of Palawan, Spanish name of Palawan, and Los Bajos is the Spanish term for the shoal, the shoals of Palawan. What are the shoals of Palawan? The Spratlys. So this is the first map also that ever gave a name to the Spratlys. The shoals of Palawan appeared in old maps, but without a name. Father Murillo Velarde gave it a name, Los Bajos de Paragua, the first name ever given to the Spratlys. This is a map made by Father Coronelli, 1690. He was a Franciscan. The Franciscans arrived here in 1578. The religious orders at the time would send regular reports to the Vatican. What were the names of the new town, what were the new islands, and so on. So Father Coronelli received all of this. He was a map maker, a famous map maker, and he drew this map. And he drew lines around the Philippines, around the Portuguese possession, in the Moluccas, and the Dutch possession, and it shows Paragua. He included the Spratlys as part of the Philippines. There is no older map from China or Vietnam showing this. We have the oldest map showing the Spratlys was part of the Philippines. We have the oldest map showing a name for the Spratlys given by a Filipino, by a map maker from the Philippines. The 1734 map of Father Murillo Velarde was printed in Manila. So we go to the turn of the century, 1900s. In 1932, the French occupied the Paracels. The Paracels were not inhabited at the time. China sent a note verbal to the French government on September 29, 1932, protesting the French occupation of the Paracels. In the note verbal, the Chinese government declared, that's the note verbal, that the Paracels lie 145 nautical miles from Hainan Island and form the southernmost part of Chinese territory. That was the start of the Chinese expansion in the South China Sea. 1932, they claimed the Paracels. But if the Paracels constitute the southernmost part of Chinese territory, ergo, Scarborough Shoal is not part of Chinese territory. The Spratlys were not part of Chinese territory. If you will superimpose this in the map of Asia, the paracels are here, then the Spratlys were never part of Chinese territory. The Scarborough Shoal was never part of Chinese territory. We submitted this, of course, to the tribunal. Now, let's go to the status of the geologic features in the Spratlys. The red squares here are the features occupied by China, 7 of them. What did the tribunal rule? The tribunal said none of the geologic features in the Spratlys is capable of human habitation or economic life of its own so as to be entitled to a 200 nautical mile EEZ. None of the features, which means that none of the islands in the Spratlys can generate 200 nautical mile that would overlap with Palawan's 200 nautical mile. No overlap, therefore, the tribunal has jurisdiction because in 2006, China made a reservation. In case of overlapping EEZ, we do not submit ourselves to compulsory arbitration. But you must show that there are overlapping EEZs. That's why our position was there is no overlap at all, and we were upheld by the tribunal. There is no overlap, therefore the tribunal can assume jurisdiction, compulsory jurisdiction. The Spratlys cannot be taken as a single unit to determine whether it's capable of human habitation. Now, to be entitled to a 200 nautical mile EEZ, the island must be capable in its natural condition to sustain a stable community of people. In its natural condition. This is now the new standard established by the tribunal. Before that, there was no standard on determining what was an island capable of human habitation. Now we have a standard in its natural condition. Now, Taiwan, which is in control of Ito Aba, placed there a desalination plant. With that, you have fresh water, you can live there. But tribunal said, no, that's not counted in its natural condition. Taiwan also imported soil from Taiwan to Ito Aba so that they can grow vegetables and trees. That's not the natural condition. So the tribunal said, Ito Aba is not capable of human habitation. It's not entitled to 200, but only 12 nautical mile. So, what is the effect of that? Because the tribunal was very strict in determining what was an island capable of human habitation. The tribunal said, if the historical record shows that there was no permanent human habitation in that island, the most reasonable conclusion is that the natural conditions of that island were not sufficient to sustain a permanent community of people. That means in the paracels, there were no inhabitants who lived there permanently, only fishermen who would stay there for a while and leave. In the pratas, none also. All the people in the pratas are government employees, personnel of Taiwan, and most of the people in Woody Island. Here, Woody Island is 214 hectares. Pratas, the biggest island, is 174. With that standard, that there must have been human habitation there in the past. And if there's none, the most logical conclusion is that island isn't capable of sustaining one. None of the islands here would qualify to be capable of human habitation, and none of the islands here. And there would be no EEZs here. So you have a clear high seas here. Did China lose here? Yes, as far as the South China Sea is concerned, because they lost an EEZ for their claim in Ito Aba, Pratas, and Woody Island. But China has the largest fishing fleet in the world. Because of this ruling, very strict, many islands in the Pacific Ocean will not be able to claim an EEZ. Islands that the U.S. hold, and the U.S. has been claiming an EEZ for these islands, islands that the Pacific Island countries hold, and they've been claiming 200-mile EEZ, they would no longer be able to claim an EEZ. And that means the high seas will be larger, and this will benefit the country with the largest fishing fleet, China. China is a net gainer of this ruling because they have more fishing grounds now outside here and outside of the South China Sea. It's actually a net gainer. Now, this issue of Ito Aba was brought a heated discussion among the lawyers of the Philippines. The American lawyers, our American lawyers, Secretary Del Rosario and I, recommended very strongly we should include Ito Aba as an issue in the arbitration. Because if you look at the statement of claim of the Philippines, it says there, we asked the tribunal to rule, one, that Scarborough is entitled only to 12 and not 200 nautical mile EEZ. When there's nothing there about Ito Aba, we completely glossed over Ito Aba. We did not ask the tribunal to rule that Ito Aba is entitled only to 12 and not 200. And as you know, a tribunal this tribunal that we have is a tribunal of limited jurisdiction. It can only decide issues specifically raised. You cannot put a prayer there that petitioner also prays for such other reliefs as are just and equitable under the premises. There is no such prayer in arbitration. You ask for a specific issue to be ruled upon. And that was our problem. We wanted the issue of Ito Aba to be clarified forever, and we wanted it raised, but the lawyers in Malacanang opposed it because they said it will be risky because Ito Aba could be declared as capable of human habitation. It will overlap with Reed Bank. And the president sided with them, so we lost that issue. If you look at our statement of claim, there's nothing there saying that Ito Aba should be declared only entitled to 12. If you look at this map, if Ito Aba has 200 nautical mile EEZ, it will not reach the Reed Bank. Only a slight portion of the Reed Bank, not the gas portion, not the area where there is gas. So there was no risk at all. And there was a case, 2012 of November, before we filed the arbitration in January of 2013, Nicaragua versus Colombia, and that involved an island as large as Ito Aba, 43 hectares. And that island is this island. It has trees, coconuts, it has fresh water, but the tribunal said it's only entitled to 12 and not 200. It's not capable of human habitation. So we were sure that if we raised Ito Aba, we will win. And even assuming that Ito Aba will be ruled as capable of human habitation by the tribunal, there will be an overlap. This will be the overlap. And how will this overlap be resolved? This Ito Aba has a coastline of only 1 kilometer. The opposing coastline in Palawan is 495 kilometers, a ratio of 1:495. What is the meaning of that? In the Nicaragua versus Colombia case, a ratio of 1.82. For every 1 kilometer coastline of Colombia, Nicaragua had 8.2 kilometers. And according to the tribunal, that is a substantial disparity. What is the result of that? See, this is Nicaragua, 531 kilometer coastline, 65 kilometer coastline, a ratio of 1:0.82. Distance is only 200 nautical miles. So there's a complete overlap. This is San Andres, an island, 2,600 hectares, about 56 times larger than Ito Aba. Nicaragua considered this is capable of human habitation, so entitled to 200 nautical miles. But the tribunal said there is a substantial disparity. For every 1 kilometer of coastline for these islands, there's 8.2 for Nicaragua. Therefore, Nicaragua gets everything here. The EEZ of Nicaragua gets this, and the Columbian Islands will be entitled to an EEZ seaward. So there would still be no risk to the Philippines if the tribunal would rule Ito Aba is capable of human habitation, because in the case of Palawan and Ito Aba, we have a very long coastline. Ito Aba is only 1 kilometer. It's not only substantial disparity, it's total disparity. So, when the president ruled that we should not include Ito Aba in the prayer, I asked Paul Reichler, what will you do now? And he said, I will discuss Ito Aba in the memorial that it is not capable of human habitation, but of course I will follow the instruction not to include it in the prayer. I said, good luck. But he said, I think I can swing it. So he wrote 14 paragraphs in the memorial discussing that Ito Aba is not capable of human habitation. The lawyers in Malacanang wanted to delete it. So it was brought up again before the president, and the president made the decision again. But this time, the president said, include the discussion on Ito Aba. So it looked to me that the president said, I already gave into this group, I will give into the other group. That's how the decision was made. So, strange, we did not raise it as an issue in the prayer, but we discussed it in the memorial. So, of course, we all know the prayer will prevail. So, at the Hague hearings, I was very alert on any question from the tribunal asking why we did not include it in our prayer. But the question was never asked. In the first and the last hearing, none. Instead, the tribunal kept on asking how Ito Aba is capable of human habitation. They never asked us, why are you discussing Ito Aba as capable of human habitation when you never ask for us to rule? And I said, wow, Paul Reichler might be able to pull it through. But then, I was only 70% sure that the tribunal will rule on Ito Aba. But then, Deus ex machina, Taiwan submitted an intervention, calling it amicus brief. They raised squarely the issue that Ito Aba is capable of human habitation and therefore entitled to 200 nautical mile EEZ. What we failed to get from President Aquino, we got from President Ma of Taiwan. President Ma put it in issue. And the tribunal had to rule on it because Taiwan is in physical possession of Ito Aba. It cannot ignore it. So the issue of whether Ito Aba is capable of 200 or 12 was put there by Taiwan. 3 months before Taiwan submitted its intervention, President Ma of Taiwan and President Xi Jinping of PROC China met in Singapore, November of 2015. For the first time, the two heads of these warring groups met since the end of the civil war in mainland China. They met. What did they discuss? We do not know. But if they discussed Ito Aba, and if Xi Jinping nudged President Ma to intervene, then I would have to thank President Ma very profusely for intervening and raising Ito Aba as an issue, and also thank President Xi Jinping for nudging Ma to do that. You see, President Ma of Taiwan is a PhD holder in international law from Harvard. He's a lawyer. He went to Harvard for his PhD, and he specialized in the law of the sea. He wrote several articles on the law of the sea. So he knew. He was in a dilemma. He knew that we did not raise it as an issue, but we discussed it so thoroughly, so brilliantly, that he was worried the tribunal would rule that Ito Aba is not capable of human habitation. So he decided to intervene, to rebut what we said. But in intervening, he placed it at issue, squarely at issue. And he lost, of course. Paul Reichler is a more brilliant lawyer than him. So that's the story of Ito Aba. The brilliance of Paul Reichler saved the Philippines from its own folly in not raising it as an issue. He saved us with a little help from President Ma. Now, these are the islands occupied by China in the Spratlys. You have Quarteron Reef, Fiery Cross Reef, Gaven Reef, Subi Reef, Mischief Reef, and Johnson South Reef and Makinan Reef. This is our biggest problem. This is the closest to Palawan, and China seized this actually in 1995 from the Philippines. So what did the tribunal rule on those 7 reefs? Because we were saying that those 7 reefs, 6 of those 7 reefs are low tide elevations, therefore they are part of our submerged continental shelf. But this is the ruling. Of the 7 reefs that China occupies, 5 are high tide elevations, and namely Fiery Cross Reef, that's outside our EEZ, Johnson South Reef within, Gaven Reef outside, Quarteron Reef outside, Makinan Reef within. 2 other reefs, Mischief Reef and Subi Reef, are low tide elevations. This is the biggest issue because Mischief Reef is what's important to us. The tribunal ruled Mischief Reef and Subi Reef are not entitled to a territorial sea. They form part of the Philippine submerged continental shelf. Only the Philippines can erect structures or artificial islands on these reefs. China cannot appropriate these low tide elevations situated within our EEZ. The Chinese structures on these reefs are illegal. Ayungin Shoal is a low tide elevation. And important, Reed Bank is entirely submerged, and like low tide elevations forms part of the Philippine EEZ as it is within the 200 nautical mile EEZ of the Philippines. We were upheld here by the tribunal, but we lost on 2 issues, Gaven Reef and Makinan Reef. We said Gaven Reef and Makinan Reef were low tide elevations. The tribunal said, no, they are high tide. So Gaven Reef is here outside our EEZ, but within our extended continental shelf. Makinan Reef is here within our EEZ. So we lost these 2 issues, but very minimal. Scarborough Shoal, that's Scarborough Shoal. It's above water at high tide, 1.2 meter above water at high tide. Obviously, it's not capable of human habitation. Not a single blade of grass grows there. You cannot squeeze a single drop of fresh water. China said it's capable of human habitation. The ruling, Scarborough Shoal is a high tide elevation, but not entitled to an EEZ since obviously it is not capable of human habitation. Then another issue we raised, we won again. The territorial sea of Scarborough Shoal is a traditional fishing ground of the Filipino fishermen, Chinese fishermen, Vietnamese fishermen. China cannot prevent Filipino fishermen from fishing there. So we won on this issue. So these 2 slides will explain to you what the arbitration was all about. These are the only 2 slides that you need to remember. Before the tribunal ruled, the red area was the disputed area with China. About 80% of our exclusive economic zone was claimed by China under the 9-dash line. This was the disputed area. After the ruling came out, all blue. The only disputed area now will be Scarborough Shoal, Makinan Reef, and Johnson South Reef. Only 3 reefs with a territorial sea of 12 nautical miles each. All the rest are free from any Chinese claim, legally. If China is still there, China is there as a squatter. So that's the story of the arbitration. We freed, in terms of area, our EEZ in the West Philippine Sea totals 381,000 square kilometers. You deduct the territorial seas of those 3 reefs, Johnson South Reef, Makinan Reef, and Scarborough Shoal. You have a net EEZ of 376,000 square kilometers free from any Chinese claim. How big is that? That's larger than the total land area of the Philippines of approximately 300,000 square kilometers. All the living and non-living resources in this huge maritime space, fish, oil, gas, and other mineral resources, belong exclusively to the Philippines. That's what we won. An area, maritime area, larger than our total land area, free from any Chinese claim. China also, the tribunal ruled further, China violated its obligation under UNCLOS to protect and preserve the marine environment when China dredged and built islands on 7 reefs, failed to prevent its fishermen from harvesting endangered species like turtles, sea turtles, corals, giant clams in the Spratlys and Scarborough Shoal. And this is the clincher. The tribunal ruled that China caused permanent and irreparable harm to the coral reef ecosystem. This is the first time that an international tribunal applied the provision to protect and preserve the marine environment. The first case ever. Now, let me show you the import of that. This is Mischief Reef before the reclamation, at the start of the reclamation. Mischief Reef, as of July 2016, 590 hectares reclaimed out of a submerged area at high tide. Totally submerged at high tide, it's now 590 hectares. 3-kilometer runway, it can take in any military aircraft of China. You have hardened hangars for military aircraft. You have the entry and exit for warships and submarines. This is very deep, 26 meters deep. Before it was dredged, it's even deeper now. You have barracks here to house thousands of Marines. How big is this area? 590 hectares. San Juan City in Metro Manila is 594 hectares. So it's just 4 hectares smaller than San Juan City. How did China dredge this? This is the largest dredging vessel in the Asia, Heavenly Whale. This is the rotating cutter, steel rotating cutter. This is dropped to the bottom of the sea. The steel rotating cutter pulverizes all the corals here, and the pulverized coral is sucked here into the ship, pushed through these floating pipes, and dumped on the rim of the reef. So all the corals here are dead because they've been pulverized into sand, and these reefs here are also dead because they have been covered with a pulverized coral, and that's how China destroyed 7 reefs, which they built into islands, and in the process, China to get filling materials from 10 other reefs. This is the marine life in those reefs. All of these are dead now. According to a marine biologist, the coral reef is the single most valuable ecosystem on Earth. A hectare of a coral reef can generate annually fish worth $350,000 a year. It's very valuable, but they're all dead now. China not only dredged, but China allowed Tanmen fishermen from Tanmen village in Hainan to harvest giant clams. This is how they harvest. They use their long shaft propeller to grind the coral so it will pry loose the giant clam, because the giant clams get embedded into the coral, and this is the result. This is now the barren reef after being harvested with giant clams with the use of propellers. The Tanmen fishermen destroyed a far larger area of coral reefs than the dredging of China in those 7 reefs. They destroyed a far larger area. That's what they do. The giant clams are carved into intricate carvings, and they could sell for as much as $100,000 each. So the Tanmen fishermen in Hainan have become multimillionaires. They drive limousines. They abandon traditional fishing. They just concentrate on harvesting giant clams. You know, Professor Dr. Ed Gomez, our national scientist for marine biology, he seeded Scarborough Shoal and the Spratlys with giant clams in the 1990s. And he said they have all been harvested by the Tanmen fishermen. John McManus, he was a Peace Corps volunteer here. He studied the Spratlys. He's a world-renowned marine biologist. He studied the Spratlys in the 1990s. He went back to the Spratlys last February of this year, and he said The damage was much worse than even I expected. I swam over 1 whole kilometer of reef before I saw a single living invertebrate. It was really massive, massive destruction. The tribunal also ruled that China violated the exclusive right of the Philippines to its EEZ when China interfered with the fishing activities of Filipino fishermen within the EEZ, interfered with the petroleum activities of Filipino vessels within the Philippine EEZ, and failing to prevent Chinese fishermen from fishing within Philippine EEZ when it constructed those artificial islands. We won on all of these issues. Now, in 2010, China claimed the reed bank. This is the reed bank. Deep within our EEZ, 595 nautical miles from Hainan, only about 85 nautical miles from Palawan. Service contract 72. It was awarded in 2010 to Sterling Energy, now called Forum Energy. After it was awarded on February 22, 2010, China sent a note verbal to the Philippines expressing its strong objection and indignation and asserting indisputable sovereignty, sovereign rights, and jurisdiction over the Spratlys and the adjacent waters. China sent another note verbal, May 13, 2010, again demanding that the Philippines immediately withdraw the decision to award the service contract to Sterling Energy because China said it has sovereignty and sovereign rights over this area. So China claimed reed bank, but reed bank is totally submerged. The tribunal ruled it's totally submerged area, it belongs to the Philippines. In 2011, the Philippines published for international bidding Areas 3 and 4, and China sent a note verbal to the Philippines stating that the Chinese government urges the Philippine side to immediately withdraw the bidding offer in Areas 3 and 4, refrain from any action that infringes on China's sovereignty and sovereign rights. China claimed the reed bank. But of course, the tribunal said no, that belongs to the Philippines. China harassed our survey vessel here. Now, you know, the 40% of the energy requirement of Luzon comes from Malampaya. Malampaya is here. It's our largest operating gas field. It will run out of gas in 10 years. So we have to develop reed bank as a replacement. Otherwise, we will have rotating brownouts in Luzon. But every time we send a survey ship here, the Coast Guard vessels of China, we drive them away. Now we have that ruling, and we have a window of 10 years to develop reed bank. The industry people tell me that it will take about 5 years to develop. So that window of opportunity is closing. Other issues resolved by the tribunal. China violated its obligation not to aggravate the dispute during the arbitration when China dredged the reefs and built the islands, and China destroyed the evidence of the natural condition of the geologic features. As a litigator, the worst thing that you can do is to be accused by the court of destroying the evidence. If you destroy the evidence, you'll get it. And China destroyed the evidence. Why? Because Mischief Reef, we place it in issue that Mischief Reef is a low tide elevation. At high tide, it's totally submerged. What China did was to cover it with sand. It's now 590 hectares of island above water at high tide. But the tribunal, we submitted the nautical charts of China showing that Mischief Reef is a low tide elevation, the nautical charts of Japan, UK, US, Russia, the Philippines, Vietnam, all of them show that Mischief Reef is a low tide elevation. So the tribunal ruled Mischief Reef is a low tide elevation despite the fact that China covered it with sand permanently. So you can understand that the tribunal was really mad when China destroyed the evidence. China also violated its obligation to maritime safety when it cut the path of our fishing vessels at high speed. Well, the tribunal refused to rule on certain issues. We asked the tribunal to rule that China violated its obligation not to interfere with the marine safety when Chinese Coast Guard vessels harassed the BRP Sierra Madre, but the tribunal said that's a military activity. We don't have jurisdiction over that. We also asked the tribunal to instruct China to comply in good faith with their obligation. The tribunal said we don't have to do that because the convention already says that China must comply in good faith with its obligation. Now, we go to the next step, enforcement. How do we enforce a ruling that people say is sweeping, stunning, overwhelming, unexpected? How do we enforce it? Well, first of all, the award will be final and binding. That's what the UNCLOS says. It shall be complied by the parties to the dispute. They assume that obligation when they ratify UNCLOS. The parties shall fulfill in good faith their obligations. Therefore, China and the Philippines must comply in good faith with the ruling of the tribunal. We're ready. China said, we will ignore. What do we do? Well, there are two parts to the ruling. When the tribunal struck down the 9 dash lines, automatically there are high seas in the middle of the South China Sea, and there are EEZs around that. That will be enforced by the world naval powers. The rest, the other part, that will be our obligation. Nobody will help us to enforce our exclusive right to exploit our EEZ. As I mentioned earlier, there's freedom of navigation and overflight here for military vessels and aircraft. The United States, right after the ruling came out, the U.S. said, the U.S. Navy will continue to conduct routine and lawful operations around the world, including the South China Sea, in order to protect the rights and freedoms and lawful uses of the sea and airspace guaranteed to all. This will not change. The U.S. said we will sail, we will fly in the South China Sea, because in the high seas, there's freedom of navigation. In the EEZs, there's freedom of navigation on our flight. We will assert those rights. France also urged its European neighbors to conduct patrols in the South China Sea. Why? Because France is concerned that a loss of this right in the South China Sea might lead to similar problems in the Arctic Ocean or Mediterranean. You see, if China can control the South China Sea as its internal lake, Russia will control the Arctic Ocean, and that's the worry of the naval powers. They cannot allow a single state to control the high seas and EEZs, to prevent them from sailing in the high seas and EEZs. Why? Because they have expensive warships and warplanes. If they have to ask permission from each coastal state to sail in the EEZ of its coastal state, then their warships and warplanes will be bottled up in their coastal waters and airspace. They will not become a naval power anymore because their ships cannot sail at will around the world. So it's their national interest, it's a paramount national interest for the world's naval power to assert the freedom of navigation and overflight in the high seas and in the EEZs of the South China Sea. We don't have to do anything. That is not our national interest. We don't have a ship that can sail. We don't have an airplane that can fly over the EEZ of China. It's really not our interest. Our interest is the second part, to exploit our resources in our EEZ. So here, because the 9 dash lines were struck down, you have the high seas, there's freedom of navigation and overflight. You have EEZs, there's freedom and navigation and overflight. The world's naval power will assert the freedoms there. We don't have to do anything. And China cannot prevent them because they will sail. Otherwise, they will lose their status as a naval power. How about the Philippines? Suppose China brings a gas platform in Reed Bank and extracts the gas there. What do we do? We can file a case against China National Offshore Oil Company in Canada, where CNOOC has assets. China National Offshore Oil Company, CNOOC, has assets in Canada. We can show the Canadian court the ruling of the tribunal. The gas in Reed Bank belongs to the Philippines. China took it away. So we asked the court to seize the assets of CNOOC in Australia and deliver it to us to compensate us for the gas that CNOOC took. That's possible. Canada is a member of UNCLOS. We can recover damages because the tribunal already ruled. China caused severe harm to the marine environment, so it's a matter of quantifying. In Nicaragua versus Colombia, rather Nicaragua versus the USA, Nicaragua proceeded on the second phase because the US refused to negotiate on the damages awarded by the tribunal. Nicaragua asked the tribunal to rule the amount on the amount of damages. We can do that. We can file a new case. Now, you see the textbook writers call the UNCLOS a package deal. Why? Because if you ratify UNCLOS, you have to accept the entire package. You cannot cherry pick. Now, the tribunal is a part of UNCLOS. It's a dispute settlement under UNCLOS. And the tribunal has made a ruling against China. But China has applied with the Seabed Authority, International Seabed Authority, created by UNCLOS. The International Seabed Authority gives permits to explore the seabed beyond the extended continental shelf. And China has 4 of these permits granted, so China is exploring the seabed now. So we will ask the International Seabed Authority to suspend the permits of China because China is not taking UNCLOS as a package deal. It's accepting benefits under the seabed provisions of UNCLOS and rejecting the dispute settlement mechanism of UNCLOS. The same thing, China filed an application for an extended continental shelf in the East Sea, opposite Japan, that's being processed by the UN Commission on the Limits of the Extended Continental Shelf, another creation of UNCLOS. So we can ask that commission to suspend the processing of China's claim because China is cherry-picking. It's not complying with the dispute settlement mechanism provisions and wants to avail of the extended continental shelf provisions. Well, we can follow Vietnam. You know, Vietnam recently installed anti-rocket artillery system bought from Israel. They installed this rocket artillery system in their islands in the Spratlys. These missiles have a range of 150 nautical miles. And all the 3 naval bases of China, Fiery Cross Reef, Subi Reef, and Mischief Reef, are within range of these missiles. So at any time, Vietnam can destroy these missiles. If at any time you can destroy the military installations of your enemy, you control your enemy. Right now, we cannot do that, but our enemy can destroy us. But we can neutralize them by installing the same artillery system. So Vietnam has done that. We can explore that also. Now, I want to clear some misconceptions. There is a misconception that great powers ignore decisions of international tribunals. Dr. Graham Allison of Harvard wrote an opinion piece in the Singapore Straits Times last July, and he said, in Nicaragua versus US, when the ICJ found in favor of Nicaragua, the US refused to comply. In Netherlands versus Russia, Russia ignored the tribunal's order, the crew be released while the dispute was being resolved. Mauritius versus UK, the arbitral tribunal ruled for Mauritius against Britain. The British government disregarded the ruling. Ergo, he said, China can ignore that because that's the precedent. Is it correct? Unfortunately, his column was repeated by local columnists and also other international columnists. I'd like to refute that. Nicaragua versus US. What happened here? The US mined the harbors of Nicaragua and supplied arms to the Contra rebels. That's a red-eye anti-tank missile supplied by the US. Those are the Contra rebels. So Nicaragua sued the US for violating its territorial integrity. The US said, no, we will not comply. We will not appear. ICJ has no jurisdiction. ICJ said, we have jurisdiction, and you must pay damages to Nicaragua. And the amount of damages will be negotiated by you, but if you cannot agree, we will decide the amount. The US refused to negotiate, so Nicaragua proceeded. And while the case was pending, in 1991, while the proceedings were going on, the US and Nicaragua struck a deal. without conceding any liability, the U.S. would provide $541 million in economic aid to Nicaragua if Nicaragua would withdraw the pending case with the ICJ. On June 5, 1991, the Nicaragua's National Assembly overwhelmingly repealed the law requiring the U.S. to pay damages to Nicaragua. On 12 September 1991, Nicaragua informed the ICJ that Nicaragua was discontinuing the proceedings against the U.S. So, in other words, the U.S. said, we will give you economic aid. We do not pay you damages or reparations. We'll just give you economic aid. But you have to withdraw that case. So, Nicaragua agreed, withdrew the case, and got the money as economic aid. That didn't matter to Nicaragua. Whether you call it economic aid, a donation, or a reparation, it's the same. It's still the same green box. So, and that's how disputes like this, after they are ruled, you cannot humiliate a losing party if the losing party is a state. You have to give a face-saving exit. Even if you won already, you do not humiliate, as long as you get what you want. So, there was compliance. Second case, Netherlands versus Russia. In that case, the Greenpeace vessel went to the Arctic Ocean, and their crew climbed this oil rig of Russia because they were protesting that there could be an oil spill and will destroy the habitat there in that area. And the Russian Coast Guard arrived and arrested them. Okay, what happened? In 22 November 2013, the ITLOS ordered Russia, the Russian Federation shall immediately release the vessel Arctic Sunrise and all persons who have been detained. Russia said, no, we will not comply. ITLOS has no jurisdiction. That was November of 2013. But December of 2013, less than a month, the Russian parliament amended its amnesty law to include hooliganism, the crime that the crew were charged, to allow pardon, to include it in the pardon. And before Christmas Day, Putin pardoned the crew and ordered the release of the vessel. But Putin said, the crew and the vessel were released under Russian law and not because of the ITLOS order. He said, we did not comply, we just released that on our own. But there was compliance. So a rose by any other name smells as sweet as a rose. Compliance by any other name is as satisfactory as compliance. Mauritius versus UK, this one, Graham Allison was flatly wrong. The tribunal said in establishing the marine protected area around the Chagos Archipelago, the UK breached its obligation to consult Mauritius. Just to consult, that was the obligation. And Graham Allison said, UK refused. Is that correct? Absolutely false. A member of parliament, Patrick Grady of UK, sought a written parliamentary inquiry. He asked, what steps is the government taking to comply with the award of the arbitral tribunal in the Chagos case? And the written reply, because that's the parliamentary inquiry, you ask questions, you get answers that way. James Doddridge, the Undersecretary for Foreign Relations, replied, the government wishes to implement the award in the spirit of greatest possible cooperation and has written the Mauritian government several times since the award, making a proposal to hold consultations about the protection of the marine environment. In short, UK readily and fully complied with the ruling. So all these cases that they show that great powers ignore, totally false. Because when the cost of non-compliance is higher than the cost of compliance, there is no point in not complying. Because like Putin, the Greenpeace are very vocal. They published all of this in the international news. So Putin didn't need that headache, so he just released. When the cost of non-compliance is higher than the cost of compliance, you just comply. You call it another term, not compliance. Now, how do we give China a win-win face-saving exit? The tribunal settled only the maritime dispute. It did not settle the territorial dispute. So there has been a proposal by Dr. John McNance since the 1990s that the claimant states in the Spratlys suspend for 100 years their territorial claim and declare that area a marine protected area. So the islands that the claimant states now occupy will be declared a marine protected area, and together with the 3 nautical miles around those areas. Why? Because the Spratlys are the nursery of the fish that we catch in the South China Sea. So if, for example, China has already built an island in Mischief Reef, China can stay there for 100 years, but will convert that Mischief Reef into a marine research center and an ecotourism center. No military facilities, only Coast Guard facilities. Is this a pipe dream? No. There is a precedent to this. In 1994, Jordan and Israel signed a peace agreement, and they created the Red Sea Marine Peace Park in the Gulf of Aqaba. There was an area where they had overlapping claims, and they said, let's just convert this into a marine protected area for the benefit of 2 countries. We jointly manage it. So there is a precedent. Why is it important to protect the Spratlys? Because that is where fish lay their egg. The larvae of the fish and eggs of the fish are carried by currents all the way to Hainan, Luzon, Sulusi, Palawan, Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam. And these are the small fish. They grow in these waters, and they are eaten by the bigger fish. The bigger fish is eaten by the much bigger fish until it reaches our table. Now, all the marine biologists, marine ecologists are unanimous in saying that you must protect the Spratlys. The marine biologists in Taiwan and in China have agreed, they have a consensus on both sides of the strait that the region should be set aside as a marine protected area. Whenever these marine biologists meet, they agree, yes, we have to protect that because that's our food source. Our marine biologist, Dr. Ed Gomez, our national scientist for marine biology, and all other marine biologists in the Philippines agree. The marine biologists in Vietnam agree. They don't, when you see them, they explain to you why. These are the fish that lay their eggs in the Spratlys. The eggs are carried all over the South China Sea, and they become they're eaten by this bigger fish. This bigger fish is eaten by the bigger fish, and we eat the bigger fish. If you cut this off, this will cease to exist, this will die. The stocks of this fish will die, this will also die, and we will have no more fish. It's a fish chain. And the South China Sea is the richest fishing ground in the world. It's a small area, but it's the richest fishing ground in the world. If we do not do this, declare the Spratlys a marine protected area, we are headed towards a major, major fisheries collapse in a part of the world where that will lead to mass starvation. Statement of John McManus, Dr. McManus, the foremost expert on the Spratlys. He knows we need the Spratlys. That's why there's urgency. And this is something that people like you can clamor, ask the government. If the other countries don't declare it, let's declare our own. The islands that we hold, we can declare it marine protected areas and 3 nautical miles around. It will not reach the reed bank because it's far away. It will not affect our gas operations in the reed bank. Now, China has offered joint development, very attractive offer since the 1990s, but no takers. Vietnam, no takers. It's from Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, Indonesia, and the Philippines. Why? If you go to the website of the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, you will see the definition of joint development. The concept of setting aside dispute and pursuing joint development has the following 4 elements. the sovereignty of the territories concerned belongs to China. And recently, you've read in the papers, we sent President Ramos to do back channeling, and he talked with Wu Shikon. Wu Shikon is the guru of the Chinese scholars on the law of the sea. He heads the research institute in Hainan, and after the talks, they issued a statement that we discuss fishing, joint fishing, etc. Everybody happy. And then when Ramos left, Wu Shikun called the press and he made a statement. However, before these joint explorations are materialized, Wu Shikun emphasized that the Philippines should first acknowledge Beijing's dominion over the shoal. It's still there. Joint development, joint fishing, great. You concede it belongs to us first. That has always been the demand of China. That's why there has been no takers. We cannot concede. In the EEZ, we have sovereign rights and jurisdiction. We cannot concede sovereign rights and jurisdiction because the tribunal already ruled. There is no overlap. If there is overlap, it's not exclusively Philippines because there's overlap. But if there's no overlap, it's exclusively the Philippines. The Constitution says in the exclusive economic zone, the use and the enjoyment must be reserved exclusively for Filipinos. So we can have joint development if there's an overlap. But the tribunal said there's no overlap. Another thing, for China, Reed Bank is territory. Everything within the nine dash line is their territory. And that's what they submitted to the tribunal. They said, we are not participating in the proceedings, but this is our position paper. This is a territorial dispute, not a maritime dispute. China says this is a territorial dispute, sovereignty over territories. The purpose of joint development is to create mutual understanding for the eventual resolution of territorial ownership. They always say it's our territory. But if we concede it's territory, then we're saying the tribunal had no jurisdiction. We cannot do that. If we accept China's premise that Reed Bank is territory, then we would be rejecting the tribunal's decision because the tribunal said it's not territory, it's a submerged continental shelf of the Philippines. So there are a lot of minefields here. We have to be careful. Besides, China is saying, our exclusive economic zone is exclusively for China. Your exclusive economic zone is for both of us. And if you don't allow us to participate, our gunboats will be there. You cannot take anything. That's exactly what China's been doing. And we also have the problem. Our Constitution says the national territory includes the seabed, subsoil, and submarine areas over which the Philippines has sovereignty or jurisdiction. Sovereignty, no problem. Land and territorial sea, that we have sovereignty over that. But in the EEZ, do we have sovereignty? No. We have only sovereign rights and jurisdiction. Sovereign rights is less than sovereignty. It's not full sovereignty. But the Constitution says or. So waters that are not part of our sovereignty, but part of our jurisdiction, it's called also national territory, although we don't have sovereignty over it. So it's also national territory. Our own definition says that EEZ is our national territory, but we concede we only have jurisdiction. So we don't violate international law because our definition of that territory, of that area, is still the same as the definition under UNCLOS. There's also a provision: the state shall protect the nation's marine wealth in its exclusive economic zone and reserve its use and enjoyment exclusively to Filipinos. How can you concede jurisdiction to China over your EEZ with that provision? It's reserved exclusively to Filipino citizens. You cannot. Now, I want also to correct some historical misconceptions because there's a lot of propaganda here. China's been saying we have been humiliated for a century by the Western powers and by Japan. So we have a right to the South China Sea, non sequitur. But they're saying that. You see, did we ever humiliate China? We never occupied a square inch of Chinese territory throughout the century of humiliation of China. In 1900, an 8 Asian alliance occupied Beijing, looted Beijing, and it still rankles in the mind of the Chinese up to today that the Middle Kingdom has been occupied by Western powers, including Japan. Why? Because in 1900s, there was a Boxer rebellion. The Boxers laid siege to the international diplomatic compound. And the Western powers sent an expeditionary force to save the diplomatic compound. They defeated the Boxers, and they defeated the Imperial Chinese army that supported the Boxers. So they took possession of Beijing. We were never a part of that. What were we doing in 1900? We were fighting the Americans in the Philippine-American War of 1899 up to 1902. While the Boxers were fighting the Americans, we were fighting the Americans also in Manila. We had nothing to do with their humiliation. We were also colonized for more than 3.5 centuries by the Western powers. And the Chinese always say we suffered from the Japanese because of the rape of Nanking. Over 300,000 people were massacred. But in World War II, Manila was the second most devastated city after Warsaw. We suffered also in the hands of the Japanese. But we have forgiven, although not forgotten. But to the Chinese, because their government still rakes that up to generate nationalism, it's still there, it still rankles in their mind. They have not moved on. But we were never part of that. So why will we have to suffer for their humiliation? We also were oppressed. Now, they also invoke the Monroe Doctrine. If the U.S. could control the Caribbean Sea, then China could also control the South China Sea. What was the Monroe Doctrine? Under the Monroe Doctrine, President Monroe said European powers can no longer colonize Latin America, the Western Hemisphere. They cannot interfere in the affairs of Latin America. But if they have colonies, they can continue with that. But no new colonies, they cannot recolonize. That was the Monroe Doctrine. The U.S. never claimed the Caribbean Sea or the resources of the Caribbean Sea. Never. Now, in 1823, there was no United Nations, no ICJ, no UNCLOS. In 1823, war of aggressions were considered legitimate means of acquiring or annexing territory. That was only outlawed in 1945 under the UN Charter, where you can no longer acquire or annex territory by war. That's already outlawed. But in 1823, that's still allowed. So it was a different world under the Monroe Doctrine than now. There was no UNCLOS then. Now, this is the Chinese are saying, this is our playground, the South China Sea. This is the first island chain. We want to push out the Americans in the first island chain. They can stay here in the second island chain for now, but we will push them out also later. But how can they push out this? But assuming they push out the Americans, why do they take our resources in our EEZ? We had nothing to do with the Americans. They're actually getting our resources and say, we are getting it because the Americans, we want to throw out the Americans. Non sequitur. It's just a story that they're saying. You see, and that's why they have framed the issue as U.S. containment of China. But the U.S. interest is freedom of navigation and overflight. We don't have warships. We don't have airplanes. Our issue with China is fishing and gas in the Reed Bank. Different issues. But what the Chinese are doing, you are a puppet of the U.S., you are there. You are part of the U.S. containment of China. No, our dispute is different. The Americans don't take position here. Because if this goes to China, they can also bid for it. Now, this is my last point. China is engaged in what China calls three warfares. The use of nuclear weapons is self-defeating. You use nuclear weapon, the other side will use nuclear weapon, both of you are destroyed. So nuclear weapons are out. If you use our might short of nuclear weapons, it could escalate into a nuclear war, so you don't want to do that. So the Chinese have developed what they call the three warfares. These three warfares were approved by the Chinese Communist Party, the Central Committee, and the Central Military Commission. They approved it. The Central Military Commission is the highest body in China that controls the military. What are the three warfares? The first warfare is public opinion warfare. China is repeatedly asserting a historical narrative, so the world will accept it as true even if the narrative has no historical basis. China says, we own the South China Sea since 2,000 years ago. They keep on repeating that. You know, I've read a lot of articles from legal scholars in the US. They've accepted it because they said China is an old civilization. They must have owned the South China Sea. So they keep on repeating that. That's the public opinion warfare. The second warfare, to assert a legal basis for historical claim, to justify the claim as an exception to UNCLOS. So China sent hundreds of scholars abroad to take up law of the sea, masters, PhD, international relations, and their theses and their articles always say China's right to the South China Sea predates UNCLOS. Therefore, it will not be governed by UNCLOS, it will be governed by historic rights. They always write those articles. That's the second legal warfare. The third warfare is psychological. They will display overwhelming might. We have air and naval bases in the Spratlys, we have warships, so that the other side, the small coastal states around the South China Sea will accept Chinese dominance. They will just submit to China's might. Those are the three warfares. It's not a nuclear warfare, but short of war. And approved by the Chinese authorities. Let's go to the first warfare of China, their historic right to South China Sea. They submitted this to the UNCLOS tribunal. They said, we are not participating, but this is our position paper. Chinese activities in the South China Sea date back to over 2,000 years. China was the first country to discover, name, explore, and exploit the resources of the South China Sea islands, and the first to continuously exercise sovereign powers over them. Correct or false, historically? You know, we had to debunk this because this is their narrative. We had to debunk it. We submitted all of those historical maps and other note verbals. The tribunal ruled. The tribunal sees no evidence that prior to the 1982 Convention on the Law of the Sea, China ever established a historic right to the exclusive use of the living and non-living resources of the waters of the South China Sea, whatever use it may have made of the Spratly Islands themselves. Historically false. We got it from the tribunal. We wanted this to debunk the first warfare. The first warfare, we successfully stopped it, parried it, blunted it. It's dead in the water. Let's go to the second warfare. China's historic right to the South China Sea waters predates UNCLOS and therefore cannot be governed by UNCLOS. In short, China's historic right is an exception to UNCLOS. And there are notable people who have accepted it. Jose Ramos Horta, Nobel Peace Laureate, former president of East Timor, he said, if China cannot accept the UN framework, that's UNCLOS for discussion, let's find another formula, a creative one where everybody would sit around the table and put forth their views. Horta said, China is a major regional power with historical grievances. Again, hook, line, and sinker accepted it. So, notable people saying, China is accepted from UNCLOS. They don't want to submit themselves to compulsory arbitration. Let's give it to them. Let's look for another framework. Exceptionalism. And people accepted it. Ironically, East Timor is fighting Australia. Australia withdrew from the compulsory arbitration mechanism of UNCLOS, but it's still subject to the compulsory conciliation. So East Timor filed a case against Australia under the compulsory conciliation, saying that Australia cannot get out of UNCLOS. They must submit to UNCLOS. You know, he should know that his arguments for China can be used against East Timor. So what did the tribunal rule on the second warfare? All historic rights in the EEZ were extinguished upon effectivity of UNCLOS. I explained that. The tribunal concludes that China's claim to historic rights to the living and non-living resources within the 9-dash line is incompatible with the convention. Ceded as a matter of law as between the Philippines and China by the limits of the maritime zones under UNCLOS. Bang, dead in the water again, blunted. They cannot claim exception because under UNCLOS, everything, all historic rights were extinguished. The last warfare of China, huge air and naval warfares will intimidate the Philippines and other claimants. You have here Fiery Cross Reef, 270 hectares, air and naval base, Subi Reef, 500 hectares, Mischief Reef, 590 hectares. They have, you know, China is mass producing warships at a faster rate than any other country in world history during peacetime. They have assembly lines for their warships. What did the tribunal rule? The 9-dash lines have no legal basis, and thus there are high seas in the EEZs of the South China Sea. China's air and naval bases built on low tide elevations have no territorial sea or territorial airspace. Now, the world's naval power will sail and fly in the high seas and EEZs. They will enforce that part of the ruling. The U.S. said, we will fly over Subi Reef, we will sail beside Subi Reef, the same with Mischief Reef, because those two reefs have no territorial sea, no territorial airspace. The world's naval power will prevent China from using its third warfare. Our problem is on our exclusive economic zone. What do? We have to marshal the support from other claimant states, use world opinion to convince the Chinese people to comply with international law, convince other UNCLOS coastal states. It is to their best interest to protect the EEZ of the Philippines because they could be next. Their bigger neighbor could grab their EEZ if they allow China to do it to the Philippines. So we are now in the third warfare. We are now here. The world's naval power will take care of this, but we are here now. That's a battle that we have to fight, and we have to be creative about this. And this is, I want to crowdsource the solution to this. We have to use the legal creativity of our legal community, our law scholars, our law students, to find legal ways to enforce the ruling. With that, I end my presentation. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, Justice Carpio. An international analyst said that in one single stroke, the verdict has changed the strategic landscape in the South China Sea. That's a major victory for the Filipino people. Thank you, Justice Carpio, for leading the way for our country. Okay. We now open the floor to questions. Attorney Vince Juan, one of our young and good-looking lecturers from the College of Law, will facilitate the open forum. Attorney Vince.
May we request Honorable Justice Carpio to please join me here on stage. We shall devote the next 10 to 15 minutes for our open forum. And we shall be following 3 simple rules. First, if you have a question, please raise your hand and wait until I shall acknowledge you. Second, once I have already acknowledged you, 3 of our staff will be approaching you and hand over the microphone to you. Third, once you have the microphone, please state your name, the office or the school that you are coming from, and then state your question in no more than 1 minute. You are entitled to only 1 question. I believe these rules are clear. We shall now proceed. If you have a question, please raise your hand. The lady in the middle of the hall.
Australia D. Rey. I am Australia D. Reyes. I have a dual citizenship of Filipino-US. I am overstaying in the Philippines because I am homeless and penniless. I am very interested in the South China Sea because I'm a retired medical doctor licensed both in the Philippines and New Jersey, USA. I would like to submit my question to the most talented and most resourceful, our Associate Justice Antonio T. Carpio, who had an extensive review. So I have so many questions, but I think you only is giving me 1 minute.
May we have the question, please?
Okay, you mentioned about we can sue China because you had a previous president of Nicaragua versus US, Jordan and Israel, and all this Russian and the Netherlands. Are you going to sue China? Because I admit they are violating the laws, but China and US are both signatories of the UNCLOS. But the UNCLOS is not all, the tribunal of the PCA is also not enforceable. So where do we stand? And also, these are the short-term and long-term problems of the Philippines. First, we have to consider the poor fishermen of Zambales. As we know, Scarborough belongs to the Philippines because it is 185
Alright.
kilometers from the South China Sea.
I'm afraid we have to cut you off with the first question and let us allow the Honorable Justice to answer the
And
first
also
question.
the reed bank, because as you mentioned, Malampaya is going to be depleted in 10 years, which is probably 5 years.
All right.
So we have to take care, and I know the Recto Bank belongs to the
Yes,
Philippines. How will you handle that?
All right. Thank you, Dr. Reyes.
I still have a lot.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Well, I have outlined some of the steps we can do. It's of course up to the government to accept or reject those steps, but there is a sequence to this. Right after the ruling, we have to sit down with China first to find out if they're willing to accept portions of the ruling, what portions they don't accept. We have to sit down first. And this process takes time because we first send somebody who's friendly to them, that's President Ramos, and we'll find out. So that's a matter of strategy. It's the government of the day that will decide when, how to press it, but all of these are available, and it's up to them to use it. I'm asking the rest of the legal community to think of other creative ways of enforcing the ruling. Now, it doesn't mean that we'll do that right away, right now, because we may find some common understanding with China. So let's give the government a chance to digest this and to try out their own ideas first if they want. But at the end of the day, this will be there. They can accept it or reject it. When I proposed that we go to arbitration, of course, they said no, we want to talk about a zone of peace. I said, okay, you go, you try that first. But at the end of the day, if all of those initiatives fail, you have only one thing left, that is the arbitration. So let's wait for them to do their thing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Justice. Second question coming from the student right there.
Good afternoon. I am Astrid Gopa from the Ateneo de Davao College of Law. Your Honor, my question is, what are the chances that the Philippines will employ its military forces in order to enforce its right over the disputed territory against China, if that is even a practical consideration under the circumstances?
You're asking what are the chances of the Philippines using military force
Yes,
to
Your Honor.
enforce the ruling? Absolutely nil. Less than nil. Because we will never start a war that we know we will certainly lose, and lose badly.
Thank you, Your Honor.
That's why we went to arbitration, because we didn't have the military might to retake Scarborough Shoal or Mischief Reef. Politically, diplomatically, militarily, economically, we will be overwhelmed. There's only one forum where we are on level playing field with China. That's the legal forum, because in the legal forum, warships, warplanes, nuclear bombs don't count. The tribunal will rule only based on the law of the sea. And that's why we won. And that's why China refused to participate, because that forum is where they will lose all their advantage. They spent so much on warships, warships don't count in the legal forum. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you very much, Honorable Justice. Can we have the third question? Coming from Dean Rudy Rapista of the St. Thomas More Law School.
Good afternoon, Justice. From the experience of Nicaragua versus U.S., where there was encroachment of the territory, and then instead of indemnification, restoration, etc., it was in a courteous way that it was just termed as economic aid. Now, in the case of the Philippines, with respect to our exclusive economic zone, which are being encroached, is there no other way wherein we will not also sacrifice our prestige by just naming it as an economic aid when ideally it would be indemnification or restoration, and without also sacrificing the pride of this very powerful country, which is China, Mr. Justice?
I don't think this will be a question of damages, because we will be happy if China will just leave without paying damages, because that's what we're asking them to do. But I have outlined a possible win-win situation where we will declare the Spratlys as a marine protected area for the next 100 years. So we'll all be dead by that time when that issue is revived. So I think, the principle in that case, Nicaragua versus the US, is that losing parties, even if they are mighty parties, they may be a superpower, they eventually comply, because it's useless not to comply. It's more damaging to them not to comply. So in this case, we'll be happy if China will just leave. But of course, it will lose face, so that's why we're thinking of creative ways. By declaring that area, the Spratlys, as a marine protected area, everybody wins. So don't take it as a complete analogy, the Nicaragua versus the US. But the lesson in that is that even a mighty sole superpower of the world had to make an arrangement with a small country, Nicaragua, just to settle the case. Thank you.
If the moderator would allow, just one follow-up.
All right, we will allow you, Dean.
The concept of joint development, Mr. Justice, on the economic zone, would it violate our sovereignty, or what? What is that? What will be the effect if for example, the government would decide for a joint development of the economic zone, which we said is part of our sovereignty?
Well, joint development is possible under our law. Malampaya now is being operated by Shell. Shell is 90% foreign. So a foreign company can lift the gas under Philippine law. There's no problem with that. We can ask Sinuk to get the gas in Reed Bank. Under Philippine law, we pay them 50-50, the same amount we pay Shell. There's nothing wrong with that. But what China wants is that they have jurisdiction, co-jurisdiction, co-sovereign right, which cannot be done. They even want us to concede sovereignty. So China's concept of joint development is a big no-no, because no president can concede sovereignty. It's against the Constitution. But there is another way. We invite Sinuk to get the gas. Under Philippine law, we give them the same amount. If China is willing, under their terms and of their joint development, to give us 50, they get 50, we will give them the same amount, but under Philippine law. Thank you.
I see. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very
Thanks
much.
so much.
Mr. Justice and Dean Rapista, can we have another question?
Good afternoon, Justice. RTC Branch 9. Is it wise for the country to do a bilateral talk with China? Or did the President of the Philippines consulted you already on this matter?
Well, thank you for that. You know, before we filed the case, as I said, we were negotiating with China on mischief reef for 17 years, and we hit a wall. China said, we have indisputable sovereignty, nothing to discuss. So how do we break that wall? How do we overcome that objection of China? So in diplomacy, you often hit a wall. So one of the tools in the toolbox of a diplomat, if you hit a wall, is to go to arbitration, get a ruling from the tribunal saying that China has no indisputable sovereignty over the South China Sea. Once you have that ruling, you resume your bilateral. That's why I said we can now resume our bilateral with China, because we have that ruling. Let's see what China will do. Because that is the entire purpose of arbitration. We want to break through the wall that China put up in terms of indisputable sovereignty. So we can talk. But before we talk to China bilaterally, we should explain to our friends, our allies, the US, other ASEAN countries, that we will talk because we will raise this issue. We have the ruling, we will place it before China. There's nothing wrong with bilateral talks because we have already what we want. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Justice. We have another question from this side of the hall.
Good afternoon, Justice. I'm Dr. Iturralde. I just want to know if there are any other ASEAN countries willing to follow your footstep to file a case against China. And if so, is there any country also tapped you or requested your services for them? This is to add pressure against China with regards to their 9 bus line.
Well, Vietnam has planned before to file a case, whether a separate case or to intervene in our case. They did not do that, but what they did was to send a letter to the tribunal saying that Vietnam supports our case. Again, I've been hearing rumors that Vietnam might file a case, their own case. But we have to understand that each country being encroached by the 9-dash lines is situated differently. Vietnam has a long land border with China, and their last border war was only in 1979. Their last skirmish in the South China Sea in the Spratlys was 1988. So they're always worried. They always calibrate their action. So how is Vietnam responding to the Chinese incursion? Vietnam ordered 6-kilo class submarines from Russia, state-of-the-art, better than the submarines of China. These submarines can sink a destroyer from 300 kilometers away. Vietnam bought Sukhoi fighter jets and bombers. Vietnam bought artillery missiles from Israel. They're now buying BrahMos anti-ship missiles with a range of 500 kilometers. They're buying it from India. That's how Vietnam has responded, because that is their history. Throughout their history, they have been fighting China. The moment they lower their guard, they become a province of China or a satellite of China. In fact, there was a period in their history, a 1,000-year period, where they were intermittently being dominated under the rule of the Chinese Empire. So they know the moment they lower their guard, they will be annexed. So they spend disproportionately a lot of money on defense. They have a smaller GDP than the Philippines. They spend more on arms than we do. Tayo, well, we used to put our money in the PDAF. But now, we still don't want to put money on defense. We did a very cheap thing. We filed a case where talk is cheap, but we won. So we are differently situated. We always thought that China is so far away, there's the South China Sea, that's the buffer. Vietnam doesn't have a buffer. Malaysia is situated differently. Malaysia has a lot of investments in China. China has a lot of investments in Malaysia. So Malaysia cannot sue, will not sue. But Malaysia has strengthened its defenses. It's buying 6 littoral combat ships from France. It has 2 Scorpion-class submarines from France. It has Sukhoi fighter jets. They're well armed. They put their money on defense. We don't. So each country reacts differently, depending on its situation. I don't begrudge them if they don't follow us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Another question from, can we first accommodate the lady at the back, please? Thank you. Or
good afternoon, Chief Justice. I'd like to ask this question. My name is Regina Mercado. I'm from the Jose Maria College of Law. When this case was shown in BBC on July 12, I was in the UK at the time, and the British government and the whole world was actually very, very happy because China finally got its own medicine. So what I'm worried, Your Honor, is that we are not prepared to go to war, but I think we should be putting our budget in the defense, because I do not believe that China is not gonna, just say, oh, you won. But I think China is not a country to be trusted. You can see how Duterte is struggling so hard. He have no sleep, fighting with this drug menace in our country. The whole economy in the Philippines are in a mess, ghastly mess, because of the Chinese government policy. I have a Chinese blood, but I do not think that it is I am not against the Chinese people. I love them and we love them. They are our brothers historically. We want to be diplomatic. I'm not raising here anti-Chinese sentiment. We should love one another. But if you look at history, Your Honor, China have gone to Tibet, also in India, and what they did to other countries in Africa. They screwed up all of African states, and they destroyed the environment in Africa. And that's why I am saying this government must, all of us must go into military training, men, women. It is not, it is true. Please, should not put like the Vietnamese. I admire the Vietnamese government. It is to put our defenses on guard.
Right.
Because the Chinese control the whole economy in the Philippines.
Right.
We are in a gas limits because of what they did with our drugs.
May
So
we
I
now-
said that's all. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. We will treat that as a comment or a reaction unless Honorable Justice would like to say something about it. No, Can we have another
Except
question?
to say that I also have Chinese blood.
All right. But again, just like our reactor has said, we all love the Chinese as well. The gentleman? Yes. Yeah. Pointed by Glenn.
Okay. Hello. My name is Carlo Casas. I am neither a lawyer nor a law student, but I would like to ask, because I've been to Taiwan. I've studied there for 5 years, and I've seen something very scary as I was having a conversation with someone while I was having lunch, and he had a faint Chinese accent, and he was saying, as we were discussing mistakenly discussing about the Scarborough Shoal, and he said that the Philippines was once belonged to China, and that idea for me is very scary. So as we can see, the tensions international within the international community is not getting any smaller. So my question is, how far does China have to go before that tension finally snaps and the international community finally has to do something to assert their authority or to contain China, because their expansion is not stopping, it's getting bigger and bigger by every decade.
All right. Sir, Justice.
Well, I read a recent column saying that Admiral Zheng He visited the Philippines. That's totally false. Admiral Zheng He never came to the Philippines. There was also an assertion that Admiral Zheng He, when he left the Philippines, he appointed a Chinese Governor General. You know, there are many stories like this, but all of these are false. I've seen a map of China that claims everything all the way to the Vatican. I mean, during the century of humiliation of China, they were so mad that they wanted to claim the world, the entire world of the Western powers. So they drew maps. Some of their maps included Sulu, others included the Vatican, others included the entire Philippines. Of course, you don't own a country just because you put there in your map. We can pass a law that the entire USA belongs to the Philippines. It will not mean that we own the Philippines. Those assertions don't mean anything at all. So don't be bothered with them. What you should do is dig up history to show that Zheng He was never in the Philippines. And there are Chinese scholars of Zheng He. They specialize on Zheng He. And they've written so many articles saying Zheng He never came to the Philippines.
Thank you very much, Sir Justice. We're down to our last, okay, we'll accommodate the last 3 questions. Let's start with the lady in front, please. Miss Dabi.
So, hello. My name is Carl Don Dabi. I'm from De La Salle University, policy and accounting student. So, I have a question. There have been reports that China allows Philippine fishermen to fish in Scarborough Shoal. How true is that? What is the effect of the incident if China allows the Philippine fishermen to fish? What is or are your opinions about it?
Well, as of now, my information is that we have not been allowed to fish. Filipino fishermen have not been allowed to fish in Scarborough Shoal. I think we'll have to sit down with China because, well, there is a ruling that the Scarborough Shoal has been declared a common fishing ground. we have to sit down with China to decide on the ground rules, because we cannot overfish there. We have to decide with China how many tons a year can their fishermen extract from Scarborough Shoal and how many tons a year. Because if we allow our fishermen to get everything, or the Chinese to get everything, there will be nothing to fish there next year. So it has to be sustainable fishing. You determine the fish catch every year. And you must put up rules so that they will not quarrel. So we are not in that stage yet. We're proceeding to that stage.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you very much. Let's have the second to the last question from the gentleman at your back, Ms. Glem.
Good afternoon, sir. I'm Redenda Martinez of the University of Mindanao. My question is the commitment of the members of the UNCLOS. Is there any move for an economic restraint on the part of the members of the UNCLOS by not complying with the order or the decisions of the UNCLOS?
All right.
Well, there are no sanctions stated in UNCLOS because the parties, when they ratify, they bind themselves to comply. And unfortunately, there is no world policeman to enforce the ruling. So we have to think of creative means, other means to enforce that ruling. So you're talking of sanctions. I do not think other countries will support us. If we ask for sanctions, they will not, because they trade with China. So we have to look for other means. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sir Justice. And the final question coming from the gentleman right here. No more questions? One last question from this side of the hall. One last. Sir, yes, you are acknowledged.
Good afternoon, sir. By the way, I am Joseph from City Hall also. My questions is, what happens to the tribunal rules or arbitration if against China, either China will be succeed or not?
Can we state the question again?
My question is, what happened on the tribunal rules or arbitrations against China?
All right. What will happen to the tribunal decision against China? Did I restate it correctly?
What happened to the tribunal rules against China? Either China will be succeed or not.
All right. Okay. What will happen to the ruling against China? Will China succeed? Any comments there, sir?
Well, I've outlined what we can do to enforce the ruling. There are two parts to the ruling: the freedom of navigation and overflight. The world naval powers will enforce that. We don't have to worry about that. We have to worry about how to exploit exclusively our own resources. If China gets the gas there, we can sue. We can sue China for damages. We can ask the Seabed Authority to suspend their licenses. And I'm asking the rest of the legal community to think of other creative means, because this will be an ongoing thing.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your questions, and thank you, Honorable Justice Carpio, for being gracious and generous with your time. For more questions, I believe there is a press conference after the event right there. So you can raise your question, although the time would likewise be limited. I'll turn you over to the host for today.
Thank you, Vince, and thank you to Azadine Zaira, and Glemery. I would like to call on the President of the Supreme Student Council, Carl Di Maligalig, for his closing remarks.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. To conclude this event, I think a few thank yous are necessary. In behalf of the Ateneo de Davao College of Law community, I would like to extend gratitude, first and foremost, to Senior Associate Justice Antonio Carpio for gracing us with your presence. Especially for once again giving us a comprehensive discussion on such a complex issue in a manner that it can be easily comprehended. To the Dean of the College of Law, Dean Manuel Quibod, thank you for being supportive in the preparations leading into and in the conduct of this afternoon's event. Thank you, Dean. To the honorable judges and the members of the bar who are in attendance, thank you for making time to support this event. Of course, to Attorney Cecilia Angeles, for being actively involved as ever in the organization of this event. It would not have been as successful without your guidance, ma'am. Our deepest gratitude also goes out to the deans and professors of the different law schools in the Davao region, not only for your presence this afternoon, but for helping us reach out to as large an audience in the legal community as what we have here today. To my fellow law students and to the students of the different universities, thank you for making time, and we hope that you found as much pleasure as we did in the privilege of learning from no less than Justice Carpio himself. To all in attendance, I hope that we could pass on the knowledge that has been imparted to us this afternoon. So, thank you everyone for coming, and good afternoon. May we call Dean Manuel Quibod and Justice Carpio for the presentation of token of appreciation.
On that note, today's forum has now ended. We would like to thank everybody for your presence here this afternoon. There is a press conference that will follow on that side of the hall. Thank you very much.
We have to sit down with China first on the ground rules for
we have to press on our exclusive rights over the West Philippine Sea?
Well, we have not yet sat down with China to discuss ground rules for fishing. We still have to sit down with them, and we still don't know their response on the joint fishing. They said that they will ignore the ruling, but it doesn't mean that they will not agree on joint fishing.
Sir, I'm Karina Cañada from Finster, Davao. Would the agreement on common fishing sacrifice our sovereignty, the sovereignty of the Philippines?
No, because the common fishing rights do not touch on sovereignty. We may be the sovereign in Scarborough Shoal, but if since time immemorial, fishermen from other countries are fishing there, then they have a traditional human right. So these are two separate aspects. Ownership can belong to one country, and the rights to fish can belong to several other countries. It doesn't follow that country that has fishing rights automatically becomes the owner. It doesn't follow.
Good afternoon, sir. I'm Jermaine De La Cruz from Edge, Davao. So, could you present us a timetable as to what the government is taking right now? Since you said earlier that last August 8, President Duterte sent former President Ramos to have a backdoor discussion with Chinese authorities. Do you have a timetable for the next?
Yeah, I wish I can give you a timetable, but I do not know myself the timetable. That's the province of the executive, the DFA. But I think we have to do this pretty quickly because on fishing, we need to have our fishermen go there as soon as possible.
Can I have another question? You said also earlier, sir, that fishing has been constrained as of the moment. Did the government give an alternative livelihood to those fishermen who were affected by this?
Well, I don't know if the government is giving, but I have proposed before that, let's say, our fishermen who used to go to Scarborough to fill up their banca in one day, but now it takes them 5 days because they have to fish further or other areas. Then the government will subsidize the gas or diesel for those extra 4 days. I mean, we must subsidize. I don't know if the government is actually doing that.
Good afternoon po. If China will retain their position of not hindi po nila susundin yung ruling nila, ano pa po yung iba nating legal reports, sir? Kung meron pa, at saka kung pinaghahandaan na po ba ito ng government in case that
Well,
may
as I
ganong scenario?
said, there are two parts to the ruling. The ruling says the 9 dash lines are void. Therefore, automatically there are high seas and the EEZs, the naval powers will sail there. In a way, they're enforcing that. Our problem is how do we exploit our EEZ exclusively? And I've already also mentioned what we can do if China goes there and puts up a gas platform, what other measures we can do, and I'm asking the legal community to think of other creative ways.
Sir, can China's claim that this issue is a territorial dispute and not maritime entitlement be somehow reconciled in the bilateral talks proposed by the President?
Well, I think that has been ruled already by the tribunal, and we cannot give an inch on that because the moment we agree it's a territorial dispute, then we're saying the tribunal had no jurisdiction and the decision of the tribunal is void. That would be the implication.
We mentioned 2 questions kanina. We just accommodate siguro one more question.
Your Honor, will there be any sort of discussions as to the rehabilitation of the dredged marine areas and which parties will be involved? Will the ministries of department and departments of environment in both countries also be looking into this issue, environmental issue?
Well, there should be, but we should be happy if China will just leave. Now, if China does not leave, then we will be forced to go to the next step to ask for damages.
With this overflight navigation and overflight, even Hillary Clinton, who will probably be possibly the next president, she emphasized this overflight. Don't you think our coastal area will be flooded with the traffic of nuclearization and militarization because of this overflight?
Now,
Freedom of navigation and overflight.
well, the overflight is only over the EEZ. There's no freedom of overflight in our land territory, only in the exclusive economic zone beyond our territorial sea. The freedom of navigation is also in the exclusive economic zone beyond our territorial sea.
Don't you think it can be abused?
Well,
With these giant powers, they don't follow rules.
well, it says there is freedom of navigation and overflight for warships and warplanes. They can sail there 1,000 times a day. It does not violate anything.
Last question. You never mentioned about ADIS, the Air Defense Identification Zone. China mentioned that if they are threatened, they will use this ADIS. What do you think of this?
Well, China has threatened to establish an air defense ID zone in the South China Sea. They've already established one in the East China Sea. It's possible they will. It's possible they will establish, and we will just have to live with that. I'm not so much worried about an ADIS than as much as a reclamation of Scarborough Shoal, because every state has a right to establish an ADIS, an air defense ID zone, because it's just to monitor air traffic entering your territorial airspace. Thank you.
So that would be all. Thank you.
That's their condition.